Good morning, everybody, or from Australia, I'd say good day. But I'm not actually originally Australian. I'm French-Canadian, but I have been living in Australia for the last 25 years. So as Brent said, I look after the Australian practice energy and resource sector. So I'm a version of but in Australia, and I have a global power sector leadership role. I was really pleased to be asked to moderate this panel. I guess for two reasons. So when I think about Australia and US, and Houston in particular, there's comparisons because both our countries, or both our regions, fossil fuels are a pretty big important part of our economy, especially in Australia. LNG exports right now. Coal is a huge export commodity for Australia. Our base load is largely still coal. At the same time, we have a booming focus in renewables. So that's one part that it's important from Australia and from Houston and Texas, the impact on jobs, the impact on the economy. And I had a chance to actually, while I was here, I've been at this conference for the last 3-4 years, and I had never been to go and see outside of this hotel area. So I went to the ship channel. I went and visited. Regina said, Ted, you got to go and see the ship channel. So I went to San Jacinto and had a look at the ships going out the port. I did one of my little videos. I'm actually quite proficient on social media, doing these little stories coming out on social media. And I really wanted to tell the story of how important the ship channel is to your economy here, and how the traffic is it's an everyday thing. But it was really fascinating to see how the hub, and I see the importance of the petrochemical industry. And that was one important point in terms of when I think about this panel. Another element, when I contrast US and I contrast Australia, big differences between federal level and state level. We have that back home. We've just actually had a reappointment of our government, to all unexpected. It was a big surprise. We thought that there was going to be a change of government, but our federal government is on a different platform to our states. We have got states across Australia that are pushing 50% renewables goals, whereas the federal level said we are going to meet our Paris commitments, no more, no less. So we've got separations in terms of what the states are doing, and at a federal level. And here, we heard Hawaii. Melanie, you're an expert in terms of California, and you'll share some of those perspectives, but there are differences here. If you're on the East Coast or on the West Coast, and where you sit. Interesting on your table, nobody's mentioned this, but just released is this 2019 Change Readiness Index assessing countries. So I have a country's readiness for a climate-ready future. And I haven't looked at the full report. It only got released today. But there's a page here that actually talks about the index of the countries. And guess what? Australia 13, US 13, and Australia 14 on the readiness index. So how funny coincidence is that? So with that, let's get this panel started. So we're really fortunate. We do have one panel member who's done a no-show. Something's happened that he had a better date today, but I've got an illustrious panel. So with me, beside me, is Melanie Kenderdine. She's a partner over at the Energy Futures Initiative, extensive experience in terms of the US energy industry. Bios are on your table. Jason Klein from Shell, and looks after energy transition strategy and various other roles. Jason's been in Australia multiple times, so I've also got some friendships here where I've got people who understand the Australian market as well. And then Ned is MD at Rocky Mountain Institute, and I've also understood that Ned's been spending some time in Australia, so there we go, got this partnership going. So what we're going to do, we've got some themes we're going to cover. We do want to cover some of the statements that were made or some observations from the other panel, but to kick things off, I'm going to ask each of you to give your opening perspectives of how you're seeing this transition on the theme that's called out for this panel, are we doing enough? So let's start with you, Melanie, and then we'll hear from the others.
Well, let me deviate for just a second and say that the coldest place in the United States in the summer is in a conference room in Houston. The over air conditioning is substantial. I was in Fukushima, in Tokyo about 2 months after Fukushima, and they shut off the air conditioning. It was the summer, they shut off the air conditioning, and the men they wore loose shirts, no jackets, no ties, no socks, sandals. And I came back convinced that I wanted to design an eco-friendly line of men's business wear, because we air condition for men's suits in this country and women freeze. That's why I'm sitting up here. Yeah, I knew the women would love it, okay?
And this room is cold.
It is freezing. Yeah. That's why I'm wearing a blanket on the stage. My perspective, and I work with Secretary Moniz. I've been working with him off and on for 21 years. And we have started the Energy Futures Initiative after we left the government on January 20th at noon, 2017. And we are focused on deep decarbonization and the technologies and the policies, energy technologies and policies to get us there. We believe that climate change is an existential threat. We are happy that the Green New Deal has highlighted climate change as a significant issue that deserves a lot of attention. It is, however, kind of aspirational and pretty prescriptive. And we are instead focused on what we call a Green Real Deal, which is avenues, pathways to address climate change that support flexibility, optionality, and innovation, and that are supported by those principles. And so we have spent a fair amount of time focusing on that. I'll say a little bit more about the study we just did in California in a minute, but just to illustrate the regional differences that we need to be paying attention to, particularly those people who are pushing electrification of everything, which I think is problematic, certainly in the more difficult to decarbonize sectors like industry. But I'm looking at the regions right now. This is electricity in West South Central, which is Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and one other state, I can't remember. 23% coal, 49% natural gas is power generation, 10% nuclear, 14% wind, and 0.5% solar. West North Central, a very different profile, and that's Illinois, et cetera, 53% coal, 9% gas. Contiguous Pacific, okay, is 2% coal, 32% gas, I think they'd be shocked by that, and 38% hydro, 7.4% solar, 7.3% wind. And so the regions of the country have very different, certainly electricity mixes, I would say energy mixes as well. These are electricity numbers. And so the pathways for deep decarbonization are going to be very different in those regions. The innovations and technologies that are needed will be very different in those regions. And quite frankly, the costs of deep decarbonization are going to be very, very different in those regions. And we need to be cognizant of that when we go out and say we need 100% wind and solar. When you look at the West North Central and it's 53% coal generation, that's a very, very tall order for that region of the world. And therefore, we think we need to focus on innovations and technologies to address these regional differences. So.
Thanks, Melanie. Jason, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for inviting me to speak here today. I think so. For Shell's perspective, we firmly support the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we have published last year the Sky scenario, which was talked about earlier today, as one of the scenarios that's out there. And what Sky attempts to do is show what it could look like to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's important to talk about two goals of the Paris Agreement. We here in the U.S. talk about decarbonization, and that really is the agenda in the U.S. But there is also an energy growth agenda in the developing world. There's 1 billion people in energy poverty, and the Paris Agreement says that we not only need to decarbonize, but we need to provide energy to that growing 1 billion people. So the challenge is we need to double the amount of energy supplied in the world and reduce the emissions to net zero in 50 years. And that's going to require a global rewiring of the energy system. Sky shows that it's technically possible to do it, but it's going to be challenging. We talked a bit earlier in the last session about all of the above, and what Sky shows, and it's not our forecast, it's not our business plan, but it's just a scenario that shows how you get there, is that you do need to do all the above. We need 10,000 CCS projects around the world. We need to end deforestation as we know it. We need to triple the rate of electrification and grow new energies 50-fold. And ultimately, consumers need to care. People need to want lower carbon, higher efficient products, goods, and services. So we have a ways to go. It's a big challenge. What does it mean for our industry? Well, and we saw this in the last panel or in the earlier session this morning, the Sky scenario shows oil demand plateauing in the mid-20s, and natural gas peaking in the 2040s. And we'll talk later maybe about the role of natural gas in the transition. But it's going to take a big change to make all these things happen. We also completely agree with Melanie's point. This is not one size fits all. And in the Sky scenario, you can dig in region by region and look at how it plays out. China's transition will be different than India's. It'll be different than Europe's. And here in America, it will increasingly be different state by state and region by region. It's not one size fits all. West Virginia is not going to look like California. Texas is not going to look like Ohio. We also recognize, though, that there needs to be leadership to make this happen. Governments need to lead, cities need to lead, and companies need to lead. We have set very aggressive net carbon footprint reduction ambitions. And most notably, we're not just talking about the emissions from Shell's facilities, we're talking about a 20% reduction by 2035 in the emissions from ourselves and from our customers. So we're actually talking about the emissions that come out of your tailpipe when you buy a gallon of e-power at the local Shell station. And we've gone a step further recently in tying our executive compensation to that. So we've set a short-term target that by 2021, we want a 3% net carbon footprint reduction from 2016, and our executive compensation will be tied to that, and we'll continue to set those. We also, if we're going to defend the role of natural gas, we need to be clean about fugitive methane emissions. And we've come out at CERAWeek this year, and Gretchen Watkins, who leads our U.S. operations, set a target of 0.2% fugitive methane reductions, and we invite the rest of the industry to join us on that. Many have joined us through OGCI and other vehicles. So, we need to lead, we need to be aggressive, and it is going to mean a fundamental rewiring of the global energy system. It's a huge transformation.
Thank you for that. Ned, you're from a think tank. I've read about your work.
Think and do tank.
Think and do tank.
I'm on the do tank side.
You're on do tank. Tell us about your do.
So much to talk about. Well, I guess I have a very similar perspective or perspective as everybody else talked about it, but I have a different way of thinking about it, I guess. I see us in an energy transition that is stoppable now. It's not a question of do we need it. It's not a question of will it happen. We're smack in the middle of an energy transition. Unfortunately, if you go out and count assets, you don't see it because it's a rate thing. The rate of change is so high right now, and it's exponential in a lot of places that we don't understand, and we don't really think about how fast it'll drive change. I think the other observation that I have that tells me we're in the thick of this energy transition is until very recently, The entire conversation around climate was ultimately driven by the IPCC and state-based actors, with the IMO and ICAO trying to do what they can about shipping and aviation. And it, frankly, in my opinion, wasn't working. In fact, we really don't know if it's working or not because the entire way of evaluating is 2 years behind and not very effective. But in my world, and I have the luxury of going over the world and talking to the biggest customers in the world and the biggest players in the supply chain, when I talk to them, it is clear now that the emerging driver of a focus on climate change scenarios, in fact, 2 degrees is not even in the conversation, 1.5 degree scenarios, it is the biggest companies in the world. It's non-state actors like cities. And as these customers on the demand side of the problem are starting to really look very seriously at their trajectory, their carbon trajectory, their energy trajectory, they are firmly planning themselves in a 2050 without carbon and looking backwards and saying, how do I get there? And they're quite proactive in looking up their supply chains and looking for their energy suppliers or their transportation suppliers, say, help me figure out how to get there. But if you can't help me figure out how to get there, I will do it myself. And they are willing to go back to first principles and rethink a transportation system, a logistics system, an energy system that is designed for 2050, not designed for 1875, 1900, when we were all about bringing electricity to the masses. And so this transition to non-state-based actors, I think, is now a driver of energy transition. And companies like Shell are doing a fantastic job of trying to work with them and help them get out ahead, are going to actually start driving the change. And the states will be left trying to say, what can we do next? I think the last point is the challenge, and something I hope we get a chance to talk about today, is how a company like Shell or how a city like Shell can work through the tremendous value destruction opportunities, or negatunities, as Amy might call them, in the energy transition, and the value creation opportunities, and how they can figure out, how do I manage the value destruction in my business by replacing it with value creation? How do I do that in a very nimble way? I think your customers are willing to work on it with you, but it is something that everybody's got to understand is likely to happen. So I'll stop there. I think we have a lot to talk about, but and I'll bring up the question on the emergence of the systems.
Yes, and I'll come back a bit later. I do want to pick up on the point you made around Shell. You know, your leadership team was in Australia just last month. Want to be the #1 power company by the 2030s, and some of those conversations, people were asking your leadership around, well, how are you going to deal with this in terms of value creation, value destruction? How are you going to deal with the growing business? You're moving into new areas, which people are saying, wow, this is really quite different. But hold that for that. We just heard from a number of senior executives around the actions they're doing. They were all trying to, they're trying to paint a good story around we're doing stuff. We're looking at a range of solutions. We believe in this. What's your take on, is it enough? So what's your assessment, Melanie, right now? And if you step back, you think about your California analysis, and you've got a good read on the US market. Are we doing enough?
Well, no, we're not doing enough, is a simple answer to that. As you mentioned, we just completed a major study in California, deep decarbonization, and we focused on their 2030 goals and their 2050 goals. And California is a little unique in its emissions profile. 39% of their emissions are from transportation. That compares to 34% in the US. Industry's 23%, that's 15% in the US. Electricity is 16% of their emissions, 31% in the US. So they're decarbonizing their energy, their electricity system pretty significantly. Buildings are 9%, US 10%, and agriculture, they're 8% in the world, or the US at 7%. So they have a little bit of a different energy profile. we looked at 2030 and, as I said, 2030 and 2050 goals. It was not a policy analysis. It was what pathways technology pathways can you use to meet your 2030 goals and meet your 2050 goals. Now they have a 60% renewables by 2030 based on the incremental additions of renewables in California. We think you can meet that renewable goal. But to meet and they also have a 40% CO2 emissions reduction, CO2e emissions reductions by 2030. To do that, the pathways, we identified 31 pathways to meet that goal by 2030. And those pathways were sector specific. In the electricity sector, by far, the largest emissions reduction pathway was CCUS on NGCC plants. We found 11 plants. It was by far the largest pathway. In transportation, it's not electrification of vehicles. But quite frankly, by 2030, California adds as many vehicles to its roads as they are requiring to be electrified, or their goal is to electrify 5 million vehicles by 2030. So they're not gaining any ground in transportation. The largest emissions reductions were from CAFE standards, efficiency standards, enhancing efficiency on the road. And industry was CCUS, and buildings was efficiency, not electrifying buildings. Efficiency got you three times as many emissions reductions as electrification of buildings. And so I'm happy to share that with anyone. Let me say one thing about electricity, and there's a big push for electrification. These are numbers in California. They will vary by region. California, and so there's solar and wind, huge peaks in the summer in both solar and wind, and hydro, quite frankly, and valleys in January. So January to June. The delta between January and June for wind and solar was 3.1 terawatt hours. Okay, huge difference. Seasonal variation in generation from your wind and solar resources. And then a couple more data points. California in 1 year, 2017, these are not forecast models, these are data, 90 days with no wind. So 1/4 of the year, no wind, and there were 10 days, 7 days, 6 days, 10 days, 9 days in a row with no wind. Battery storage, which California's got a fair amount, but it's a 4 hours duration storage. PJM, it's an hour, hour and a half. That's ancillary services. You cannot address 10 days in a row with no wind with current batteries. So I heard a little bit about batteries earlier. We do not see by 2030 anything other. It's a short turnaround, not very long between now and then from an energy perspective, that you need existing technologies with incremental improvements. To your question, by 2050, deep decarbonization, net zero, we don't see the technologies that exist today to get you there. You need breakthroughs in technologies. So innovation is hugely important.
So Jason, you'd have a perspective of from Shell. You spent time in Australia. You got a read here on the U.S. market. Your take in terms of progress and how diversification of technology. And I did want to ask you something also on the role of natural gas, but.
So I think it's a mixed record in the U.S. right now. I think, from a federal policy standpoint, there's a huge gap there. We don't have a carbon price. We're not really talking about it, and we're unlikely to talk about it until there's changes in D.C. So that's a challenge. I think there's some good stories around wind in Texas and solar in California, and there's a lot of investments being made. I think consumers aren't quite there yet. You know, climate is being discussed amongst the Democratic presidential candidates, which you know was not discussed in the last cycle on either side. That's good, but the top 4 selling vehicles in the United States are still full-size pickup trucks. So let's not forget that. That's the consumer base. I think that, you know, natural gas clearly has a role to play, and we're blessed with a lot of it and the ability to produce it quite cheaply. In many ways, California does have a battery system right now. It's called natural gas, and that's what keeps California running at night when the sun goes down, and that's great. You know, I'm concerned with Melanie's numbers on the amount of coal still being generating power in lots of other parts of the country, and I think California shows that natural gas and renewables complement one another. I also think we need to understand the global role of natural gas and the ability of the U.S. as an LNG exporter, and the important role that plays in the global climate system, because every cargo of LNG we ship to Asia, I would have said China, but that's harder these days, we'll just call it Asia. Every cargo we ship there is hopefully displacing coal-fired power generation, which is still a huge environmental issue. But I would also implore that natural gas will face challenges. It is already facing challenges from a number of NGOs, and we in the United States are not doing ourselves favors by deregulating methane emissions and making it easier to be a sloppier operator. We need to be able to demonstrate that our operations are responsible and that our emissions are low, so that we can confirm that natural gas is a clear winner over coal.
Well, just giving you a perspective of some of the challenges. Some of you would know this in the audience, that there's a plan for a major opening of a new coal mine in Australia. It makes global headlines. The Adani development in Queensland and the Galilee Basin, and at the same, we're going through this challenge. We just had an election, and through the whole electorate. Up in Queensland, the government has remained, basically the population want jobs. And the Galilee Basin would be a big provider of jobs in that respect. We have these challenges happening, and it's really complex, you know, as we're working that through.
I mean, so I had the pleasure of living in Queensland for several years and absolutely loved it, but it was hard not to notice the irony that we were using grid power, which is generated primarily from coal, to power the gas compression stations to drive the gas to the LNG plant to export it to China. So Australia was burning coal to export gas. And I think it's a big challenge in Australia because of the jobs impact. And I think you would see in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and kind of U.S. coal mining country the same challenge. We've not done anything to address jobs retraining or how we impact coal miners, and we saw a real visceral reaction in the last election that this was about jobs, and we need to figure out a way to address that.
That's why I wanted to call that out, because there's a lot of conversation, and when it goes to people's livelihood, when it goes to people's pockets, it goes to jobs, it goes to so many things, and that impacts politics big time. Ned, you've got a particular focus on transportation and an interest there. The role that you see right now in decarbonization with transportation, would you like to share some insights on what you've been seeing?
Right, well, obviously transportation is a pretty diverse term, right? There's personal mobility, there's goods movement, there's airplanes. I think the first thing is that this idea that we have an electricity system and a transport system is breaking down rapidly. One of the fundamental challenges that makes the visions work is the fact that in the future, we see a world where energy is relatively fungible. You can transform it in time, space, and form. And with really inexpensive excess renewables, the ability to move from electricity to liquids, or liquids to electricity, or electricity to gas, or gas to electricity, becomes relatively inexpensive. And then it's your bet on how quickly those technologies come down. So I think the first thing is that a highly electrified transportation system, while is difficult to imagine if you just think about transportation, it becomes much easier to imagine if you think about it as an integrated part of the energy system planning for any region or country. And most of you already know your car is only used 4 to 6% of the time. It's a sitting tank of gas. So it's a storage mechanism right now for future transportation. But there's no reason why that sitting tank of gas can't be a sitting tank of electrons or a sitting tank of hydrogen. So that transformation is key. It enables a lot of the other transformations that happen. I think it gets increasingly difficult the heavier the transport you want to use. But if you look at shipping, the IMO was trying to wrestle with this whole question about shipping, and they were struggling with it. It turns out air quality drove this new low sulfur fuels standard, which everybody was assuming would get punted down the road, but it's not. So all of a sudden in shipping, you see a very material desire to move to a new fuel. And from what I can tell, talking to both shippers and customers, the fuel of choice for shipping is very likely going to be a hydrogen or a hydrogen-carrying fuel. And that industry is already talking about commercializing ammonia-driven ships by the 2020s and 2025 so that they can have them fully commercial in 2030 and fully adopted in a global fleet by 2040. That's the timeline the industry's thinking about. Now, if that's true, let's just say that they're interested in it and they're trying to figure it out. Where do you want to develop that technology? Where should be the capital of the development of the transition to a hydrogen-based economy for the marine shipping? Well, it's going to be Rotterdam, because Houston's not playing. If Houston wants to play in the transformation of shipping marine fuels, it has a massive opportunity, just maybe. And then in aviation, same deal, right? I mean, people talk about hydrogen airplanes. Amory is a huge fan of hydrogen airplanes, and someday we can get to hydrogen airplanes. But right now, we can put biofuels on airplanes, oil-based biofuels on airplanes right now. We can move towards synthetic fuels. Again, that industry has been very hesitant to make the move. It's been enabled by an oil and gas industry that is perfectly happy to sell aviation fuel. But all of a sudden, in the last 6 months, everything seems to be shifting. And I think that, again, if any region in the world wants to become a leader in the development of a new fuel for aviation, could be Houston, could be India, right?
Might be competing with Australia. We're going crazy on hydrogen right now.
If you happen to have a huge desert, variable need for electricity, because you have a highly dynamic electricity system, so you need to provide ramping services or ancillary services here and there. Turns out you produce a lot of zero to negative marginal electricity. Well, in that world, you can do amazing things with hydrogen, but you have to think about this connection between electricity and the end use.
And you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, to Ned's point, Shell has already laid the keel on the first liquid hydrogen transit vessel, a tanker, and it's in a partnership that's going to take hydrogen produced in Australia to Japan, because Japan is hungry for hydrogen, and we're doing it because Australia sees the opportunity. We have shipping expertise and cryogenics, and Japan has a demand.
And you put a lot of ships in the ocean.
Yeah, so absolutely that's there. It's happening already.
We're working through this pilot, so for people's benefit, Australia has signed up with Japan to do a $500 million pilot to ship hydrogen to Japan. And if they can prove that with a sequestration solution, then it's the export market. Yeah. And then after that, the rest of the country is looking at hydrogen for various use, but really it's for an export market.
Absolutely, and because that's what Australia is, right? Their economy is built on exporting commodities, whether it's ore or coal or natural gas or maybe hydrogen. And I think you also see Norway taking a leading role, looking at the opportunity for blue hydrogen with CCS and things. So that there's other people taking up that space. I agree with Ned. We have infrastructure, we have transportation, we have capital discipline and the understanding of how to do big projects, and we got a lot of storage facilities on the water. Where else should we be doing this than Houston?
So, well, let's talk about Houston. Let's switch gears.
Yeah.
In the lead up to this conference, we've called this conference low carbon. There was some conversation actually. What should we call this conference? It started with climate change. Low carbon. Does Houston have a reputation? Does it have a branding challenge?
So my view is absolutely we do. It's not just a branding challenge, it's an actual challenge that we need to face. When Shell agreed to sponsor this summit, it was pitched as a climate change summit. And it was changed to the Low Carbon Energy Summit because some people in this room are uncomfortable with the phrase climate change. And what I'm here to say is, if we want to be the leader of the energy world, and we want to be the energy capital of the world, we need to attract talent and capital and investment and innovation. And if the people who want to do those things think that we don't even like to talk about climate change, they're not going to come here. They're going to go to San Francisco. That's why they're all in San Francisco.
Melanie, what's your take on that?
I'm just, truth in advertising, I was actually born in Houston. Spent a fair amount of time here with my grandparents. The one thing that we looked at in the California study, and I think is important to Houston, and we developed a taxonomy for it, that's as far as we've gone, is how can we repurpose carbon infrastructure, carbon-related fuel infrastructure, et cetera, how can we repurpose that infrastructure for a low-carbon world? Because there is enormous value in that infrastructure. There's enormous cost for its replacement. And quite frankly, corporate officers whose companies have invested heavily in that infrastructure have a fiduciary responsibility to protect the value of that infrastructure. And without some policies that help transition that infrastructure, and hydrogen's a perfect example. How much can you put in existing pipelines? How much can you use in a gas turbine, et cetera? But I think that we need to provide policy support to give corporations the opportunity to transition that infrastructure to low carbon infrastructure. Without that support, I think that, again, I'm always in climate trying to stop the immovable objects, because that delays addressing climate change effectively when we actually need to accelerate how we address climate change. And I think the value of that infrastructure has contributed significantly to a delay, and that we really need to spend some time thinking about what we can do. Obviously, that affects Houston in a very, very big way.
So all of the panel before us, they were very bullish about the resources, and I've seen it firsthand when I actually went south. The capabilities, the infrastructure. But what else? What else can be done? What else should Houston be doing to capitalize on this?
I think Houston is synonymous with oil and gas, not energy.
Okay.
People in the know it's an energy town, but it's an oil and gas town. And I think there's a legacy of the extractive industry that needs to be abandoned. I mean, the reason why we have problems in Australia around the communities in coal, we have problems in Appalachia, and you have problems, it happens in every extractive town in the world. It's a boom while it's great, and it's terrible while it's not good. And the extractive industry has never really taken ownership of that community renewal and that community transformation, that when they leave, that they leave a better place than they got there. So I don't think we should try to change that brand. I think we should abandon that brand, and that this should be the energy capital of the world. And it should be the, not just get rid of everything that looks and feels extractive, and embrace everything that looks and feels development. How can we contribute to the development of the communities we operate in? How can we contribute to the economies of the countries we partner with? How can we lead, just like good forest rangers, how can we leave the campground better than we got there? And that mentality, I certainly see it in the executives at Shell. And I think you probably see it in the C-suites and executives of all the major oil and gas companies. Maybe not many of the miners, but the people operating the fields, the people operating the coal mines, it's not there yet. I mean, they're still perfectly happy to be in the existence that they've been in for the last 100 years, and we have to change that.
Can I say something on that? About extractive industries. This is another area that I'm looking at, is minerals and metals that you need for wind, solar, and batteries. There are significant extractive industries involved in those supply chains as well. And World Bank did a study of those 21 metals, minerals, and processes, iron smelting, kind of stuff. And there are 21 of them. And cobalt is one of them. And 5-year-olds are mining cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo. So oil and gas, extractive industries, you're not getting away from extraction when you go to wind and solar generation. And so I'm not sure that is the humane, responsible, capture the carbon on wherever you need to capture the carbon in the oil and gas industries, which is what I think Houston should focus on. Not only it is the oil and gas capital in the country, but also developing model frameworks for CCUS, both for its industry and its extraction.
Okay.
Can I just make a clarifying point?
Yeah, I'm just going to also just let people know if they have a question, if they can give it to Brett, and we can take some questions.
I just want to make sure there wasn't confusion. I'm not saying get out of extracting. We need to extract. I think the point is the mining company of the future, and I'm working with some of the biggest in the world, they're going to be a circular company. They're going to think just as much about how to bring that material back than they are how to get it out of the ground. So yes, with the critical minerals and the critical metals coming down the road, there is a major effort to try to get more. But the business itself is not about identifying reserves, proving reserves, and depleting reserves and moving on. It's about the full life cycle of whatever you are stewarding in the communities which you're stewarding.
Jason?
Yeah, I just want to touch on the Houston piece. I mean, I think, and following up on Melanie, I mean, if you've been to the ship channel, you've seen it now. It's a non-attainment area. We have a serious and high concentration of CO2 there. And if we here in Houston can't figure out how to do CCS with either $35 or $50 a ton 45Q in Houston with that huge concentration of CO2 and a bunch of depleted oil fields right next door, we've got to figure that one out.
And that it shouldn't just be about EOR, okay, which is what the projects are right now. The first of a kind capture for a lot of the industrial processes are less than the value of that tax credit. People should be paying a lot of attention to that.
So I think that's an area.
Intellectual power that's in this region, in this city. Yeah. I mean, and all the infrastructure that you've got, all the access to services. If you guys can't crack this.
That's right, and I think we also, I do think we have all the capabilities here, and we have the infrastructure, and it's all here. I think we also could do some things on leading. I mean, if instead of just building new highways every 3 years on a kind of cycle around town, we were a city that embraced electric buses or hydrogen fleets or whatever it is, to do some demonstration projects to show that Houston is a thought leader in this space, to kind of change this impression that we're just the good old boys of yesteryear. That would be, I think, a big step.
And there'd be people in the audience here that are heavily from the services industry, from extraction upstream. What would be perspectives around the risk that people would see? Let's look at it from the other angle.
I don't think I understood the question.
Okay, so what would be the risk to Houston, maybe going strongly the other way?
So I see it, real. I mean, we have oil and gas companies coming to us to help us develop a 1.5 degree strategy. I mean, what does that mean for reserve management? What does that mean in Australia? What happens with Asian exports in a 1.5 degree scenario? So I think that it is diminishing customer demand because they're seeking a low carbon supply chain. I think it is diminishing right to operate in those places where you're not seen as a partner in the growth of the economy and you're more of a extraction from the economy. And I think the last one is, and we see this as a major factor growing right now, is The investment community, who's used to looking at various asset classes, is now starting to understand how to think about climate risk in those asset classes. And every single one of the asset classes that has very long-lived, energy-intensive assets that have strong carbon risk in them, especially long tail risk in that, they're trying to figure out what do we do about this. So I think you're going to see a flight from assets and investment strategy, corporate investment strategies that have high climate risk to places where there's low climate risk.
And I also think we need to help educate people. I think there's this fear, and I see it with some of the younger recruits into Shell that, oh, we're going to go into new energies, and I was an idiot and studied petroleum geology. I've wasted my education. That's just not the case. All of the scenarios, including Sky, show that there's a role for oil and gas for as long as any of us are alive, and we're going to need to continue to produce it. But you need to be, the lowest cost producer, and you need to be the lowest greenhouse gas intensity producer. And as long as people are focused on that, this industry isn't going away.
Well, I got a nice question here. Can you comment on Houston's potential as a nation for offshore wind? Potential for offshore wind, given the reasonable wind potential in the Gulf of Mexico and the industrial knowledge. I know that there's offshore wind up in the up east on the East Coast, but what about for Houston?
So Shell is participating in a number of blocks in the offshore Northeast, and we're very excited about those. There you have states with renewable portfolio standards that are demanding to bring this power in. Texas is a free market, and there's not the kind of RPS standard yet. I also think you might want to talk to all of the conservationists, as that's the largest flyway for migratory birds in North America. So those two issues aside, I think,
I don't know what the water depths are in offshore Texas. Offshore wind has much higher capacity factors than onshore wind. And I think you can get 45, 50, 55% capacity factors in your offshore wind. So that's helpful. Water depths are important because it might have to be floating offshore wind if the water is too deep. I don't know about the migratory birds, and I think offshore wind is essential, actually.
Okay. So just with the time remaining, priorities for Houston? We keep on bottoming out this conversation. What should be the priorities in terms of moving the agenda forward?
I think we have to, as a community, start to embrace the future and not be afraid of it, and that requires some education. I think we also need to ask ourselves if the fundamental assumption of Houston, which is if you had a low cost of living and lots of jobs, you could continue to attract jobs. That has led to a lot of sprawl, which has suited Houston very well for 40 years. I'm not convinced that the next generation of innovators and leaders have that dream that most of us did, that you could go to Houston, get a job, get a house in the suburbs. I'm not sure that's the dream anymore, and we need to think about how do we adapt? How do we compete with Austin and Silicon Valley and Boston, which are just very different urban environments than the one we've grown up in?
I actually think that, and I go back to CCS and using it here, okay, in Houston for both its the oil and gas and for its industrial base, but also looking at a global market for those technologies, the CCUS technologies, and somebody mentioned earlier the developing world, and I had. When I was at DOE, I had my staff look at 20 most populous countries in the world in 2015 and what their populations were going to be in 2050. India becomes the most populous country in the world. China actually loses a little population. Modi has made a commitment to universal access to electricity by 2022, which means adding 450 million people to the grid in India, and it gains 500 million people in population by 2050. That's almost 1 billion people in one country that needs electricity, and India is sitting on a pile of lignite. They're going to use that coal. Capturing the market for that, for capturing the carbon from that generation is a huge global market opportunity. And I don't think with what Houston needs here, those are technologies that could be exported, and I would not miss that opportunity. So.
Okay.
I think it's, if one thing Houston can do well is put capital to work in an amazing way. And we've seen the investment in clean tech just struggle from people who really don't understand the energy industry. So I think that a very big opportunity for Houston to capture the venture, social impact, private equity investment in new technologies, and working with investors in the Shells and the Exxons of the world to say, be okay with heavy investments in new energy. Because, as everybody knows, everybody's just waiting for somebody to tell Shell they got to shut down new energies because it's not their core business. I think we're beyond that now.
Yeah.
But we need to educate the investors.
And whose role is that? Whose role is that to do that?
Well, I think sort of everybody plays a role.
Yes.
I think it's got to be a collective message from the CEOs and the boards of the oil and gas companies to those investors, articulating why it's strategically critical for the future of the asset class.
It's because the question actually I had here is whose role is it to build greater awareness of the need to make smarter energy choices at consumers, and is it enough? Is it being done? We in Australia, communicating the complexities of energy so that everybody can understand is it's not easy, but we've got to find a way. We've got to find a way. I've done a lot of work in the power sector, and when I went to my first APIA gas conferences, I was floored by how often they didn't talk about consumers, floored by just talking about the big bills, big infrastructure, and how do they engage with consumers, which is part of the reasons I got so much challenges.
If I could say that where we are opposed to magical thinking, we do unbiased analysis of data, facts, technologies, et cetera, et cetera. Magical thinking is that when solar, $36 to $44 megawatt hour, that doesn't include storage. Okay, if we had a national grid and you could wheel power around, and that would be great, but you need storage. The storage numbers are $104 to $140. So our capacity markets are forcing zero to marginal cost generation out into the markets, but it's not incentivizing the infrastructure that you need to support that generation. And so I think educating people on how electricity works would be really, really important for pointing us in the right direction.
Okay. So with that, I'll ask you each, just in terms of your final point, final message, final takeaway you want to leave. Ned?
Well, CEOs need to stand up and be as articulate about this as everybody else. I think one of the problems in Australia when the South Australia blackout happened was the BHP CEO coming up and blaming renewables, when in fact it was a terrible regulatory design that caused the problem. And that just set the country back.
Right.
Yeah, and I think Houston has all the will in the world and capability to be the energy capital of the world for years to come, but we need to take some positive actions soon.
I would say one thing, we haven't talked about it very much, but I have been intrigued by new players in the energy space. And I looked at building energy management, global energy drones, smart cities and grids, cybersecurity, energy and cybersecurity, and energy data analytics, and who the main players were in those areas. None of them were energy companies. And they also, those companies have come to us, they don't know that much about energy either. And Houston, which knows so much about energy and how energy systems work, started working and educating those players in the market. It would be extremely helpful. When you go to an American Gas Association meeting, none of those players are there. When you go to an API meeting in Washington, none of those players are there. And we need to broaden our thinking, and Houston does, about who the energy transition, which is what this panel is about, and who the new players are in that market, and get them to understand how energy systems work. They need to get the conventional energy to understand how the new digital systems work, and start working together.
It's a great point. I was in Singapore last month. I visited a startup, energy startup with NTU University of Singapore, and works that they're doing with global corporates and accelerated startups. Free Electrons is another global startup.
Right.
And the work that they're doing with academia, with corporates, is just fascinating. So my final point, I've been at this conference for the last 4 years, and I can honestly say the dialogue has shifted. I saw the dialogue has shifted definitely at this conference. I've heard more about energy transition, transformation, the role of corporates, and the role that Houston can play in that. So with that, I want to thank our panel, and it's time for lunch, I think.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause.